on Facebook and Zoom. Greetings and welcome to our post-film discussion with scientist Tierra Curry. My name is Ginevra. I'm the program coordinator at Sustainable Woodstock. We are a nonprofit founded in 2009, and our mission is to inspire, educate, and empower everyone to live environmentally, economically, and socially responsible lives. Sustainable Woodstock runs a climate change and sustainability film series. We show films related to climate change and sustainability every month. For this month, we screened A Sense of Wonder, a film featuring the pioneering environmentalist Rachel Carson. I do want to go ahead and read the film's bio here for anyone who might not have seen it, and is joining us. That's going to be completely fine, but it's just good to get a sense of the film. So, when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962, the backlash from her critics thrust her into a center of a political maelstrom. Despite her private persona, her convictions about the risks posed by chemical pesticides forced her into the role of controversial public figure. Using many of Ms. Carson's own words, actress Kailani Lee embodies this extraordinary woman in a documentary-style film which depicts Carson in the final year of her life. Struggling with cancer, Carson recounts with both humor and anger the attacks by the chemical industry, the government, and the press as she focuses her limited energy to get her message to Congress and the American people. So that's just a description of the film for anyone who didn't see it or just who saw it and wanted a reminder. Carson was an extraordinary woman, and we are really happy to be joined tonight by another extraordinary woman. So before we get started, I just wanted to run through the agenda and how this meeting is going to operate. We are recording right now, and we are on Facebook Live. You are currently muted and your video is off. You are not able to unmute yourself or turn your camera on. So if you have questions during the talk, please type them into the chat box on the side of the screen. You'll see at the bottom a little dialog box with the word chat. If you click that, you should be able to type your question in. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please just type in the comments of the video and I'll keep an eye on that. We will follow up with a recording of this event and any resources that are mentioned afterwards in an email. And I think that's it for me. So I'll now introduce our director, Michael Caduto, who will introduce our speaker. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everybody. And I really want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and especially to Tierra Curry for agreeing to present to us and then answer questions after you've watched this amazing film about Rachel Carson's life. She's such an inspiration to so many people of all different generations, and her work is no less relevant today, maybe even more so in many ways. And so Tierra Curry is a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she leads a Saving Life on Earth campaign to end the global extinction crisis. She works nationally with individuals and groups in support of celebrating and protecting biodiversity. Tierra specializes in freshwater species and monarch butterflies. So Tierra, we're so happy that you are joining us. It's a pleasure and an honor, and we'll look forward to hearing your talk and then having questions come, and we'll pose those to you at the end of the program. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here. It's an honor to talk about Rachel Carson's life and work, and then I'm going to talk about the global extinction crisis. But first, we're going to talk about pesticides, and then we'll talk about how you can help. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll do questions and answers. So I'm a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining the webinar this evening from Shawnee territory. The Center for Biological Diversity is a national conservation nonprofit, and we're focused on saving endangered species. And so we work on polar bears and giraffes and elephants and grizzly bears, but also crawdads and freshwater mussels and fairy shrimp and bees and other insects that a lot of groups don't work on, because we think that every species is important. We think every plant and animal is important, not just for their own sake, but also for our health and well-being. We think diversity, biological diversity, is important for humans. So I was asked to do this webinar a couple of weeks ago, and it gave me time to just really resubmerge myself in Rachel Carson's work. It had been a couple decades since I read Silent Spring. And as I reread it, I was just bowled over by just how brave and relevant and prophetic Rachel Carson's work was. Everything she said is still true. And it's amazing to me that she foresaw a lot of the environmental issues that we have, and she spoke out against them at a time when that was very unpopular, and especially as a woman, it was very bold of her to do that. And she had a very challenging life with poverty and disease and taking care of people, and she persevered through all of that. And I think that it was really driven by her deep love of the natural world, and that just really shone through in this film. So I'm excited to discuss it with you. The 1962 publication of Silent Spring is hailed as the beginning of the modern environmental movement. This book truly changed the world, and the chemical industry tried to silence her, tried to downplay her voice, but this webinar tonight in 2021 shows that her voice will never be silenced. Her work is still relevant. And so I just put a bunch of quotes in here that from Silent Spring and her other writings, and I'm just going to read them. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them. And so I think one of the reasons the chemical industry was so mad about this book and her work is that not only did she say, this is bad, she also said, this is unnecessary. There are other ways to do this. She just saw through the excuses. And so it's pollinator week this week, and that's really good because pollinators need all of the help that they can get. I can't overstate the importance of insects to life on planet Earth. There's about 5.5 million species of insects, and they do so many things. They're the base of the food web, nutrient cycling, so many things. But insects are in a lot of trouble. You may have heard about the insect apocalypse. Scientists across the globe estimate that from 10 to 40% of all species of insects are declining. And this is a red flag for, civilization, because insects pollinate about 80% of flowering plants. Some plants are pollinated by bats and some by the wind, but insects do the bulk of the work. And we know why insects are declining. Half of insect declines are directly attributable to pesticide use. And so I put this little pin on there. If we die, we're taking you with us. It's a little bit of an overstatement, but not really. Pollination is like essential to civilization and our survival. I'm going to read another Rachel Carson quote. Who has the right to decide for the countless legions of people who were not consulted that the supreme value is a world without insects, even though it be also a sterile world ungraced by the curving wing of a bird in flight? The decision is that of the authoritarian temporarily entrusted with power. He has made it during a moment of inattention by millions to whom beauty and the ordered world of nature still have a meaning that is deep and imperative. And I'm gonna assume that everybody on this webinar tonight agrees that nature has a beauty and an ordered world that is deep and imperative and essential to us. And now we are paying attention to what is happening so we can use our collective voices to try to change things. At the beginning of the film, Rachel was writing a letter to her friend about a morning that they had spent together in September watching the monarch butterflies. And she closed the letter by saying, "That is what those brightly fluttering bits of life taught me this morning. I found a deep happiness in it. So I hope may you." And I was so touched by this, that by watching the butterflies and speculating about their life cycle, she felt a deep peace and happiness. And other people have described seeing groves of monarch butterflies as the very personification of happiness. So when she was alive and writing this, we didn't know where the Eastern butterflies go in the winter. And that's kind of why she was speculating about it. In the 1960s, scientists had no idea where the monarchs migrated to. It wasn't until 1975 that researchers talking to local people found the mountains in central Mexico where the butterflies gather for the winter. They cluster on 5 or 6 mountaintops that are all above 10,000 feet. And that's the super generation of monarchs. So the monarchs that are born in the northern United States and southern Canada at the end of summer fly all the way to Mexico, spend the winter living on their lipid reserves, and then migrate north again in the spring. And it's amazing. They lay their eggs on milkweed plants. Milkweed is the only host plant for the monarch. And then they die and the next generation is born. And so the subsequent summer generations each migrate further north until fall. And then those butterflies one day are like, we gotta go to Mexico. They've never been to Mexico. Their great, 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 great grandparents overwintered in Mexico. And so it's just amazing. And this was unknown at the time. The mountaintops where they go are now protected as the International Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. And we're going to talk about the decline of the monarchs. So monarchs east of the Rockies are the ones that migrate to Mexico for the winter. Milkweed is their only host plant. They're declining for numerous reasons. One of the biggest is the loss of milkweed plants because of increasing use of herbicides, especially glyphosate. And so with the advent of crops that have been modified to be resistant to glyphosate, especially corn and soy in the Midwest, the monarch population has plummeted. And then you add on top of this the threats of global climate change, which disrupts the migration and causes severe storms like the big freeze we saw in Texas this spring, and roadkill. Think about it, a monarch butterfly in southern Canada and northern US has to get all the way to Mexico. It has to fly across so many roads. So there's lots of reasons why the monarchs are declining. Pesticides is a really big one. The eastern population has declined by 85% since the mid-1990s. There used to be close to 1 billion monarch butterflies, and now there's about 150 million. They count them during the winter when they're clustered on these mountaintops and they're sitting still. A whole army of volunteers with World Wildlife Fund in Mexico goes out to estimate the population size. And scientists estimate that the monarchs need 6 hectares of occupied forest habitat to be out of the danger zone of migratory collapse. And last winter, there were 2.83 hectares of habitat. So it's pretty bleak for monarchs. And it sounds like you're like, Tierra, there's millions and millions of them. How can they possibly be endangered? When you think about all of the hazards that they face and how big the population size has to be to withstand weather, to withstand climate change, to withstand predation and roadkill, we need a lot of monarchs to overcome all of those threats. And a lot of people say that monarch butterflies are fragile. And if you look at this picture that Chuck Patterson took and posted to Journey North, you'll see monarch butterflies are anything but fragile. That butterfly survived severe winter storms in Mexico a couple years ago, flew north all the way to Texas again on those tattered wings. And that is amazing. Monarchs are really resilient. They're really tough. They've been doing this migration for hundreds of thousands of years, and now we're disrupting it. My colleague Patrick took that picture of the butterflies clustered on the trees. It's an amazing experience. And this past year, because of COVID, the sanctuaries where the monarchs cluster for the winter provide a vital source of income for the impoverished communities that live around the reserves. And because of COVID, some of the reserves were closed. People weren't really traveling. Those communities lost their income. By serving, selling stuff and serving as tour guides, they make a lot of their yearly income during the winter when the monarchs are in Mexico. They didn't get that income this year. And so there's been a really big increase in logging, illegal logging of their habitat. And there's a group called Butterflies and Their People in Mexico that is working to try to protect the butterflies, try to protect their trees, but also to increase the standard of living for the people who live around the reserve. So I encourage you to check them out, Butterflies and Their People. Monarchs west of the Rockies overwinter on the coast of California, and their population has declined by a staggering 99%. This population has always been smaller. At its peak, there were about 1.2 million butterflies. This last winter, there were fewer than 2,000 butterflies. There are 1,914 butterflies counted in the trees overwintering. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Drought is one. Milkweed is sensitive to drought. Ubiquitous pesticide use is a huge one. And then people played a role in this population collapse too, because a lot of people really love monarchs and they want to help. And so we're like, plant milkweed. So you go online to buy milkweed, and the first milkweed that pops up is tropical milkweed because it's the easiest to grow. It's not native to the United States. It doesn't die back in the winter. And so the monarchs don't get the chemical signal to go into diapause, go to the coast and hang out for the winter. They just stayed active. And so combined with mortality from pesticides and from drought, and then people planting the invasive tropical milkweed, which just confused them and kept them in people's yards for the whole winter, the migration has basically collapsed. And so there is a proposed legislation right now, the Monarch Act, which you can support, and that would provide emergency funding to try to bolster the Western population. So the monarchs are monarchs are a gateway bug. A lot of people who don't care about other insects start to care about insects because they learn about a butterfly and how awesome it is. And then they want to help other butterflies and other pollinators. And monarchs actually themselves aren't great pollinators, like bumblebees or a lot of our native bees. But because there's so many of them and they have such a huge range, they play some sort of role in pollination, but not as much as the bees and honeybees. But they're a popular icon for all pollinators, and certainly protecting habitat and fighting climate change and reducing pesticide use to protect the monarch butterfly would save so many other pollinators. They're kind of an umbrella species. So I got another quote for you from Silent Spring. The question is whether any civilization can wage relentless war on life without destroying itself and without losing the right to be called civilized. These insecticides are not selective poisons. They do not single out the one species of which we desire to be rid. Each of them is used for the simple reason that it is a deadly poison. It therefore poisons all life with which it comes in contact. And this quote is amazing because at this time, there weren't neonicotinoid insecticides and they weren't in use in the United States. Neonics came into use in the US in the mid-1990s, but this quote could have been written about them. And so seed coatings that are designed to protect crops like corn from pests become toxic. Neonics are so toxic that they make the whole plant toxic. So any pollinator that lands on them, any other insect, is going to have negative and sublethal, if not lethal, effects from that. And they don't stay put. The insecticides, the neonics especially, end up in the soil, end up in the water, and they hurt other species that you wouldn't even really think about being affected by an insecticide. Like birds, amphibians, phytoplankton can be killed by the runoff of neonics, and then that affects the fish. And recently there's been a lot of research about deer because neonics are having harmful effects on deer fawns. And so Rachel Carson just saw the beginning of like the chemical revolution, and it's even worse today. So pesticides are ubiquitous today. The Environmental Protection Agency has registered for use more than 18,000 pesticides. So each of these is harmful individually, and the synergies between 18,000 pesticides are going to number in the trillions, the effects that they're going to have when they're mixed together. And the United States is really terrible about banning pesticides that we know are harmful. And by pesticide, I mean herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, all of the sides. Pesticide is like the umbrella word for those. And so other countries, including large agricultural producers, have banned a lot of pesticides. More than a quarter of agricultural pesticides in the US are banned in Europe. We know this and we're still using them. And the wildlife harm from these pesticides, it's not just the pollinators, it's everything from the soil microorganisms. An important study about this just came out showing how pesticides affect the health of the soil, all the way up to killer whales that are eating salmon that are contaminated with pesticides. So thousands of endangered species are jeopardized by pesticides, countless wildlife and human health. And another quote from Silent Spring, it is ironic to think that man might determine his own future by something so seemingly trivial as the choice of an insect spray. The maps I put on here are from the USGS website. You can look up the annual usage of any pesticide on their website, and it gives you these maps. And so I just chose a common neonic imidacloprid. You see in 1994, it was just used in a couple of areas. And then by 2017, the dark red is areas where the most of it was used. And same for glyphosate. Back in 1992, glyphosate was used in a lot of areas, but not as intensely as it was in 2017. Look at that huge swath of the country that has just been drenched in glyphosate. The USGS, the United States Geological Survey, has done an amazing job compiling the information about pesticide runoff and total pesticide use. And they've gone out periodically and tested all of the surface water in different parts of the country. And in some of the studies that they've done, every single body of water they tested had pesticides in it. One of the most recent studies, they got water from creeks, and 80% of the creeks had 5 or more pesticides in them. And about 54% of groundwater is now known to harbor pesticides. So basically, we're part of this vast chemical experiment that Rachel Carson was railing against back in the 60s, and it's still going on today, and it's even worse. And she even foresaw the water contamination and talked about the fisheries and asked, when will the public become sufficiently aware of the facts to demand such action? And so our time is definitely now. We have to demand action on these things. I spent so much time thinking about her this past week, and one of the phrases that was just totally stuck in my head was consequences remote in time and place. She was talking about herbicides and how we're trying to control vegetation. The Earth's vegetation is part of a web of life in which there are intimate and essential relations between plants and the earth, between plants and other plants, between plants and animals. Sometimes we have no choice but to disturb these relationships, but we should do so thoughtfully with full awareness that what we do may have consequences remote in time and place. This is just so true. The pesticides that we were applying back in the 1950s and 60s are still in the environment. There's a class called persistent organic pollutants, and DDT is one of them, and it is still out at the poles because of wind currents. And so polar bears and other animals and humans that live in northern Alaska and other Arctic countries are exposed to really high doses of these really toxic chemicals. And there's new evidence that not just the pesticides spreading out over space, but also over time. A study came out recently showing that generations after exposure to these really toxic chemicals, the way that genes express themselves can be permanently changed, so that like the great-great-grandchildren of people who had high exposure to DDT can manifest negative effects from that. So kind of staggering. That's all of the depressing stuff I'm going to talk about with pesticides. Now I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're doing about it, some of the policy battles that we're engaged in. We're fighting for outright bans on pesticides that are known to be harmful to farm workers and children. You can support the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, which would ban some particularly gnarly chemicals. We're seeking Endangered Species Act protection for monarch butterflies, American bumblebees, and multiple other species of pollinators that we think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should protect. We're seeking a prohibition on pesticide use in endangered species critical habitat and on national wildlife refuges. It's kind of, and Rachel Carson talks about this too, it's outrageous that on refuges where wildlife is supposed to be protected, they get drenched in pesticides. We're demanding consultation on pesticide impacts to endangered species. You would think that the Fish and Wildlife Service would work with the EPA to see before they approve a pesticide how it's going to hurt endangered species, but that doesn't happen. And they're just now reviewing how the pesticides that are already in use affect endangered species. And the draft documents that they've released show that they negatively impact thousands of endangered species. New pesticides come on the market every day, so we're fighting individual pesticide registrations. We're fighting uses of pesticides that have already been registered. And you can take part in all of these policy actions. If you go to our website, biologicaldiversity.org, and then click on action, you can see a list of our action alerts. And if you click on environmental health, all of the current policy battles that you could write a letter or send an email or make a phone call about are listed there. The other thing is consumers have a lot of power. Even if the government isn't protecting us or regulating these pesticides, you can vote with your money by buying organic when you can. And so this is kind of funny. When I was working on monarchs, they're primarily threatened by corn and soy herbicides. And so I would only buy organic corn and soy products. But a friend of mine was working on potatoes and onions and wildlife and net habitat. So she's like, if you're only going to buy one organic thing, buy organic potatoes and onions. And whatever crop you look at, if you can buy the organic version, that sends a message that you don't want this ubiquitous pesticide use. So now I'm going to take just like 5 minutes and talk about the global extinction crisis and the other things that are threatening biodiversity. But first, I want to talk about why biodiversity is important. I would assume everybody on this call agrees that biodiversity is important, but not everyone does. And so a healthy planet is essential for healthy humans. And so many things are here because of the vast diversity that supports things like cleaning the air, healthy soils, water filtration by freshwater mussels, pollination, which we've talked about. The vast diversity of plants and animals that we share the planet with is also a source of inspiration and happiness for us. And Rachel Carson talked a lot about that, like the cultural and spiritual value of biodiversity. So what's driving the extinction crisis? The HIPPO used to be the acronym, but now it's CHIPPO because climate change is such a major threat to all the species. The other things are habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, human population growth, and direct overutilization. And Rachel Carson talks about this too when she talks about the slaughter of the buffalo. And then she's talking about extinction and says that we don't even know everything that's going to go extinct because of all of the chemicals we're dumping in the environment. So scientists think that from 10 to 32% of species could go extinct by 2050 due to climate change impacts alone. And that means the protected areas like the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve or Glacier National Park or Joshua Tree National Park, even though the land is protected, the species that live there could still be lost because of climate change impacts. There's a lot of really depressing global assessments. The International Union for Conservation of Nature found that 28% of all the species that they assessed are at risk of extinction. You probably saw the United Nations a couple of years ago said that 1 million species are now at risk of extinction. And so that is very depressing, but those species are at risk. We could look back 10 years from now and say we saved 1 million species from extinction. This is not inevitable. We can intervene to help them. Another major depressing global index, the World Wildlife Fund, looked at populations of vertebrate species that they had actual data for and found an average decline of 68% in those counted vertebrate populations since 1970. And if you just look around, common species are declining. Species like bats and lightning bugs and frogs and whippoorwills that used to be really common, we just see less of them now. So there's a shifting baseline for the generation that's coming up. They don't get to see the vast diversity of things that a lot of us probably grew up with. Migratory birds are also in decline. There's been a 29% decrease in abundance of North American breeding birds since 1970. Around the country, we're losing little species that hardly anyone has ever heard of to extinction. And when this happens, it doesn't make headlines because most people don't care that a spring snail in Georgia or a fairy shrimp in Florida or a beetle in Arizona have gone extinct. But together, these stories add up to the heartbreaking extinction crisis that's unfolding all around us. And so every year we lose little species, but we don't have to. Extinction is a political choice. This is the Bramblecay melames. It's a little rodent that lived on an island off the coast of Australia, and it was the first species to go extinct due to climate change impacts alone. It lived on the shoreline, and its habitat was flooded by rising sea levels due to global climate change. And when this happened, an Australian senator named Janet Rice said, extinction is a political choice, and it absolutely is, and we have to make a different choice. And I was on a call last week, a Zoom with a scientist from NASA about climate change. And she said, we have all the knowledge and tools that we need to fight climate change. And that's also true for the biodiversity crisis. We have the power and the knowledge, we just need the political will. So that's what the Saving Life on Earth campaign is about. It's about raising awareness about the extinction crisis. We're trying to get the Biden administration to declare the extinction crisis a national emergency and to implement a lot of protections for species and funding. You can support the Extinction Prevention Act of 2021. That would provide domestic funding for the most imperiled groups in the United States, including freshwater mussels, butterflies, desert fish, and Hawaiian plants. Biden has committed to protecting 30% of US lands and waters for wildlife by 2030. That's moving towards the goal of protecting half the earth by 2050. And this is like the minimum level that we think we need to turn around the climate crisis and the extinction crisis. And I just want to note that this isn't a land grab. This isn't about kicking people off their land. This has to be done with full respect for Indigenous rights and Indigenous leadership. Just last week, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the International Panel on Climate Change put out a report together saying that we have to fight extinction and the climate crisis at the same time. And this is because a lot of the things that are being proposed to solve the climate crisis, like planting 1 trillion trees or mining rare earth minerals to make batteries, can contribute to the extinction crisis. So we have to get a good standard of living for everyone, an equitable standard of living, fight climate change, and fight biodiversity loss all at the same time, mindful of each of those things. And everybody can help be a part of the environmental and social justice that drives this. Our health is the health of the planet, is the health of the poorest communities on the planet. So we need to think about this in a global way that brings everyone up to a global standard of living that doesn't dump pollution in communities that are poor or that are already suffering from too much pollution. And also climate change impacts affects the communities that are the poorest and the least able to deal with it. So we have to do something about that, and everybody can help. Everybody can use their voice, their talent, whatever it is you do. If you're a singer, if you're a painter, if you're a poet, if you're a writer, if you're a gardener, everything that we do can help make a difference for wildlife. And while you're making personal choices like eating less meat or choosing organic produce or planting milkweed for monarchs, also I would encourage you to take policy action, get involved with organizations that are fighting for policy to end extinction. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of which was depressing, but it's not inevitable. We can turn things around. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take your questions.
Thank you so much for
That
that
was
presentation.
amazing, Tierra.
And I think I'm ashamed to realize I didn't realize that this coincided with Pollinator Week, or I'd forgotten it did. So I'm really, really happy about that. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat here and Facebook in the comments section. And we can get started with the ones that we have. I can go first, Michael, if you want.
Sure.
So we still have a huge problem with widespread agricultural use of pesticides. I'm thinking especially neonics. I'm just going to abbreviate. What's being done to ban them? Thank you.
We do have a huge problem with agricultural pesticide use and neonics. There is a push to ban them and to limit their use. Of course, industry is up in arms about this, and it comes down to prolonged fights against individual chemicals and against individual uses of the chemicals. So basically, you have to jump into the policy trenches and get involved in the really wonky battles to get specific products banned or specific uses of products banned, because I think that it would be amazing if the United States was just like, we're not going to use neonics, or we're only going to use them in really judicious circumstances, like treating hemlock trees that are being eaten by adultids. But getting a total ban, we can certainly ask for it and push for it, but the work is going to be done in the trenches against the individual chemicals.
Thank you. So I was wondering, have monarch butterflies, you kind of answered this question, I think, in your presentation. Have monarch butterflies been officially designated as endangered by the EPA? And it sounded like they weren't, but I wanted to see if you could tell us what's going on and where that stands.
Yeah, so we petitioned for Endangered Species Act protection. We asked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to officially put them on the endangered species list as a threatened species back in 2014. And that was a joint petition from the Center for Biological Diversity, the Center for Food Safety, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and the famous monarch biologist, Dr. Lincoln Brower, who has since passed away, but he was like the father of monarch butterflies, and it was an honor that he joined that petition to try to save them. So that was 7 years ago. Just this past December, the Trump administration said that protecting monarchs under the Endangered Species Act was, quote, warranted but precluded. So that put them on the candidate waiting list for ESA protection. And so to get off that candidate waiting list, the Biden administration could simply write a listing proposal for them. And then a year later, they would get final Endangered Species Act protection. We filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for putting them on the candidate list instead of listing them as an endangered species. So we're working on it, but as of right now, they're not protected. Candidate species don't get any protection. And more than 40 species have gone extinct while they were on the candidate waiting list. So it's not a good place to be. It's an acknowledgement that you're in trouble, but they're not protected. Personally, I expected the Trump administration to just deny the petition and say, no, we're not going to protect the monarch. And that would have sent us back to the beginning petition stage. So it's not the worst thing in the world. Like a not warranted finding would have been the worst, but warranted but precluded just puts them in purgatory. Hopefully, because the Western population is in such dire straits, hopefully we'll see some action to protect them. And insects can't get protected in just part of their range as like a distinct population segment like vertebrates can. So if they protect the California monarchs, they're going to have to protect all the monarchs. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of opposition to that, but there's also a lot of people pushing for that. And you can take action. You can contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ask them to go ahead and protect monarchs. And there's an action alert for that on our webpage, biologicaldiversity.org.
Okay, great. That was my next follow-up question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will send out the your website to everyone who's on the call, so they can find that kind of section of it for the action alerts, if that's good. Yeah.
The Extinction Crisis Action Alert is at savelifeonearth.org.
Okay. I'll send that out too. I'll ask you afterwards. Remember to get it. This is actually a question of mine, but I just Googled, because when you were talking about other types of milkweed that weren't native, I just hadn't ever encountered that. I wasn't aware. So I looked up native milkweed in Vermont and found a lot of species. And is common milkweed the one to plant, or does it not really matter?
Common milkweed would be great. There's hundreds of species of native milkweed. They're a pain in the butt to get started, even though they're a weed. So like this past winter, I used 2 different methods. I either took milkweed seeds and put them between wet paper towels in a sealed Ziploc bag in the fridge for the winter. And then I cut out the paper towels and put them in the ground in the spring, and all those sprouted. The other thing I did was I took egg crates and starting soil and put the seeds in the egg crate, sat those in the fridge for the winter, and then just sat those in the sun, and the milkweed popped up, and I scooped it out with a spoon and replanted it. The paper towels actually worked better than the egg cart, but that's why people plant tropical milkweed. You just scatter the seeds and it grows. The native ones are a little bit harder to get started, but it's totally worth it to do it.
Good to know.
So I was wondering, what are you touched on this already in many ways, but what are the most important things that people can do to protect species and preserve biodiversity? Like if you were going to do 2 or 3 really critical things, where would you recommend people start?
I am a big fan of policy actions. I think we need national action on biodiversity. So support the Extinction Prevention Act, support our call for the extinction crisis to be declared a national emergency. Just call up your senators and representatives and tell them you care about endangered species, because the vast majority of Americans do care about endangered species, but the vocal minority, which Rachel Carson talks about, has it all over the news that the Endangered Species Act is the worst thing ever and kills jobs and impedes progress. And so it's really important for people to speak out that they support endangered species and support the Endangered Species Act. And then there's a million things that people can do in their daily life to help biodiversity, from growing some of your own food, not using pesticides, not using plastics, demanding action on plastics. Plastics are made from fossil fuels and they're pushed on us because there's a glut of like fracked gas. And so they're just trying to make more and more plastic. And that's where consumer power comes in to reject that plastic. And then diet, takeextinctionoffyourplate.com has lots of tips on how to make vegetarian and vegan food because of the carbon impact of a dairy and meat intensive diet. And then just talk to other people about it too. There's so many people on the planet now that everything that we do and everything we can get other people to do does make a big difference.
Thank you.
A question here. What is required for a pesticide to get approval for use in the US when it is registered? What level of safety is supposed to be met? Do the companies get approval by obfuscation of the true effects like the tobacco industry did for years, or is it political lobbying that is responsible for these generalized poisons getting onto the market?
It's pretty much a rubber stamp process. I worked on coal mining a lot, and somebody at the Army Corps of Engineers told me, we're not in the business of rejecting permits. And it's kind of the same thing with pesticides. Like the EPA rubber stamps things. They don't do adequate analysis. They don't do analysis on endangered species or groups that are more vulnerable. Like freshwater mussels are the most endangered group of animals in North America. 70% of them are at risk of extinction. Pesticides are really harmful to them. The toxicity tests they do, they don't look at the juveniles. And so a lot of the chemicals that are going to keep the mussels from being able to reproduce, the adults can withstand more than the juveniles. And so it's a really faulty process. And the EPA tends to be a revolving door with the chemical industry. Even Fish and Wildlife Service under the Trump administration, the head of Fish and Wildlife Service under the Trump administration was a former Monsanto employee. So it's a very cozy relationship between government agencies and the chemical industry. And that's why our voices are so important. We have to push for stricter safeguards. And Rachel Carson talked about this too. She said, most people think that there's some protective agency out there standing between us and these chemicals. And there really isn't. We really need an overhaul of policy that's actually protective. And that's part of our Saving Life on Earth plan, is to use the precautionary principle, which is a chemical is guilty until proven innocent.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have a lot to learn about that process as well. A question from Facebook. How do pesticides affect ocean life?
They end up in the ocean. And so the pesticides, just like Rachel Carson said, they're designed to kill. So that's what they do. So at the base of the food chain, zooplankton and phytoplankton can be killed by pesticides, which can cause fish to starve, or a lot of the pesticides are stored in fat. And so that means that they build up. So if you have a fish that eats 1,000 insects and then an orca that eats 1,000 fish, the orca is going to have thousands of times the exposure to the pesticide that was just in the water. And a lot of these chemicals don't break down. Some of them do, but a lot of them persist.
So I just wanted to say that how inspiring you are. The way that you present such dire information in such an inspirational, upbeat fashion, which has kind of it creates a tension in a way that makes you want to do something even more.
There's a reason for that, and that is that people used to walk out of my talks. I would put up all the species that have gone extinct and tell their stories and how they went extinct, and people would be so depressed they would leave. And I realized, okay, we have to reframe this, not just the bad news, because there's no shortage of bad news. It has to be, here's the bad news, but here's what you can do about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We had a film in our series that came out last summer about the plight of the North Atlantic right whale. a reporter from the Boston Globe, David Abel, who's produced it and directed it, and he did a program following it too. And it's just so fraught to watch how close they are, how close they're getting, and how many of the species are actually becoming closer and closer to that break point, that Rubicon. So it's just so critical, the work that you're doing.
We have to focus on what we can do. There's so many things we can't do, but just to stay sane, we have to pick things we can do and do them, and then make noise about the other things. Because this is really depressing stuff. Like, we're thinking about extinction all day, every day, will really get you down. And so in the middle of the day, I go outside and like take pictures of bees and plant something else.
Yeah. We have 7 acres of what used to be hayfield that we now manage for wildlife. And the couple of probably 3 or 4 acres are loaded with milkweed. And we have to mow the fields in order to keep them fields so they don't grow up. So we rotate the mowing and according to the life cycle of milkweed. And we discovered that the butterflies really love to lay their eggs on the newer growth milkweed. I don't know if you've ever discovered that too, but the ones that are sprouting, that are fresh, that aren't the older ones with the flowers, tend to have way more eggs and larvae on them than the older growth milkweed in the different patches. It was just interesting.
It's amazing all the things that the female butterflies think about when they're going to deposit their eggs. Like, they like dispersed milkweed more than milkweed that's clustered. And that's because that's gonna, like, the clustered milkweed is gonna draw in the predators. So they like the milkweed here and there. And one of the mitigation things is just to plant milkweed, but a whole field of milkweed isn't as useful as like milkweed scattered about. Or like there's a big push to plant milkweed on interstates. And I'm kind of dubious about that because the monarchs are gonna metamorphose and start flying, and then boom. So
Yeah.
like, it's a start, but I don't think that's necessarily the solution. Like, everybody planting milkweed in their yard would be super helpful.
Well, thank you.
I'm gonna try your trick of refrigerating the seed. I think that's really smart.
Yeah, if you do it in the egg crate, you have to keep misting it every week. But if you just put it between wet paper towels and one of those oversized Ziplocs, you can just leave it and then take it out. Now, literally, I just cut it in two, put it under some soil, kept it wet, and it grew.
All right, that's my action item. But yeah, thank you so much. That was a really uplifting, like Michael said, presentation in a lot of ways. And yeah, someone says here, I really want to help make this world better while I'm here. Great talk. So I think people agree. We don't have any more questions, so
Okay.
I think
Well,
we're all.
thank you so much for the opportunity, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Bye.
Bye.